if you are given a totally blank slate in life to believe whatever you want, you can come up with all kinds of wacky stuff. Some of it is just not consistent with reality. So I used to have a guy in my life that used to say, all good theologians are good philosophers. Not all good philosophers are theologians, but all good theologians are good philosophers. The reason being is that they understand the rules of logic, how to think in a healthy, not just healthy, but like consistent and logical and reasonable way, right? They can make a case and lay something out in a way that's understandable. So they're good theologians because they're good thinkers. So when we think theologically, what I wanted to advocate for was constructing a worldview based on understanding what is the playground, what are the boundaries that we play our sport in, right? You know, like what is it that we're doing, like, and what can where do we get off the rails? Like when can we not say stuff? Like it's not about doctrine. Like I wanted to combat the idea, and I think a lot of people like who think theology think this. It's not about heady. I mean, it is a little bit, but it's not exclusive about heady opinions on people. Trying to like split hairs on an interpretation. It can be that. I'm not going to like theology as an academic study is a lot like that, and
but it's not just people sitting around a room debating things all the time.
But that's literally every academic study. So I mean, that's just kind of higher academics in general. Like that's not my point. My point is when we think theologically, we understand the rules in the history and the context which these came up, and it gives us a good framework to say things that actually make sense, but not only that make sense, but that are more likely or more apt to be true, right? And I won't talk about truth. Like I'm not going to lay out an epistemology for like how we construct an idea of truth. Like that's not. We don't have time for that, and I don't want to do it, to be honest with you, because that's Rick's podcast. That ain't mine. No, really, that is Rick's podcast. Rick does epistemology for a living in ethics.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
So if you really want to get into it, we know a guy. But my what I wanted to quickly lay out was like thinking theologically is knowing how to think within those rules and how to understand not only how we read scripture, which influence the rules, but also it's how we like things that aren't like nailed down, like what does Paul mean by, Romans 8, it's a great example. You can be a Christian and a Calvinist. I don't agree with you. I think you're kind of the worst. That's my opinion. Right? But you can do it because you're playing within the theological boundaries, right?
Yeah.
And you're saying,
no, because Calvinism is not just, I guess, just to articulate, maybe just make sure I'm understanding what you're saying. Because Calvinism is not just like, oh, there's these 3 extra doctrines you throw in there. Like it's a system of thought.
Yes.
Where everything is connected and it fits really well together.
Yes.
So,
but that's theology in general. Good theology is a system of thought where things are coherent. The thing that we won't get into, or I won't get into, is whether a statement is fundamentally true, because that's different. So modern Calvinists, they use what they call what is it? What type of apologetics they use? Anyway, but it's basically it's their arguments are based on consistency rather than like factual truth, because they like the hard Calvinists want to hold to like literalism, right? They want to hold to like the 5-point like old school stuff. So like since they want to hold to that so tightly, which again is fine, they don't have the ability to appeal to any kind of outside source, because the only truth is the biblical truth. Which when you say it out of context is like, oh yeah, of course the only truth is biblical truth. Well, not necessarily historically. We have a pretty good record that says not so much. You know what I mean? Like just in terms of like Israel and Egypt, right? Or even some of the other like historical events in the Old Testament. We just don't have a lot of stuff that says, yeah, that happened, like Noah's Ark. Yeah, and that's not an insult, to anybody who thinks that way. It's just there's just not a lot of evidence. So since you can't appeal to those sources, what you'll do is you'll create a system theologically that is enclosed and supports itself. But if you, the problem is with a system like that, when you make basically an entire thought or epistemology based on consistency, is if you pull one pin out, it collapses like a house of cards because it's all self-supporting.
Yeah. So perfect example would be capital F fundamentalism.
That's exactly
With
who I
this,
was passive aggressively attacking.
so yeah, so fundamentalism. For those of you who are
Oh, we're
fundamentalists,
recording.
I'm sorry because you might feel like I'm ribbing you, which I am. But uh, actually, if you've made it this far in the podcast and you're a fundamentalist, I applaud you because we have certainly said some things that fundamentalists would not agree with. But fundamentalism, capital F, I need to clarify, was a movement, and it's still very prevalent today, especially in America, that is built on uh, the theological foundation is that Scripture is a collection of propositional truths, um, which is very different than saying Scripture is true. The claim of fundamentalism is every time Scripture makes a claim, whether it makes a statement about something, whether it relates to something historically or morally or whatever it is, that statement is true in every aspect. So, for example, that's why fundamentalism is very strict on saying that Genesis is a literal, or the opening chapters of Genesis are a literal account of creation. It happened exactly that way. Um, when you get to the New Testament and you have Paul writing about the conduct of men and women in churches, the fundamentalist view is that is how men and women need to act all the time, like in every circumstance. Which is why if you have fundamentalist churches, if they're consistently capital F fundamentalist, they won't allow women to serve as leaders over men because they interpret every single phrase, every single statement in Scripture as 100%. This is a a truism. It is a propositional statement. And what you said, when you remove one of those pins from, it doesn't matter what uh, system you're working with, but if you remove one of those fundamental pins, it sort of collapses. So here's the pin of fundamentalism: is uh, any instance in Scripture you can point to and say, actually, that's not true. Like that is not an 100% true thing. The whole thing collapses. So, for example, in fundamentalism, if you criticize it and say no, creation didn't happen in 6 days, 6 literal days, that's actually not true. I mean, you can point to a different interpretation of Genesis 1 and talk about how maybe the theological connotations of it. Not saying creation didn't happen, but it didn't happen in that way. Like so well, I guess I'll put it like this. So I was watching a video, and at the end of the video, it was from a fundamentalist perspective. At the end of the video, someone asked the question, why is it so important that Genesis be interpreted literally? And the person said, and the response was, because if we question that, then we have to question everything else, and we have to say that nothing else in Scripture, or it's possible that nothing else in Scripture is true, and we end up getting to a place where we have to say that Jesus didn't actually exist because you removed that pin, because that is the entire foundation of fundamentalism. So that's an example of what Britt's saying. I thought I'd just lay it out like that. So
You laid it out in a really good way. For those of you who are listening, it's probably pretty obvious by now that I'm not a 6-day creationist, which is fine. Like, if you are, like, that's fine. We can be friends. I've got lots of friends who are 6-day creationists. I'm just not one of them.
Yeah.
Right. Anyway, my point is, it's very hard for me. Well, no, it's very easy for me to see how you can get around that issue and why that is not the say all be all, because I don't believe in 6 days, but I do very much believe that Jesus is the Christ and he lived, then died, and then rose again. In fact, I'm doing a podcast on it right now. So it's just the coherent systems, the coherentisms, I think is what's called coherentism in epistemology, is it's tough for me. It's really tough for me.
But like what you're saying, like that's why it's important to be able to think through what you believe, uh, because it it does affect how you view things. It affects how you treat things.
Yeah.
And sometimes you don't even realize everyone has a worldview. Everyone has a theological worldview. More specifically, you might not realize it, but you do.
Yeah.
It's been formed either by your family or your pastor or your church. It's not that it's inherently good or bad, but at some point you do need to own it, and you do need to be able to reflect on it and begin to ask, what is it that I believe? Does it make sense? Is it coherent? And I think it is important for us to talk about this because
It is.
what I see happen is people start to ask that question and they don't realize it's okay to ask that question, and they end up leaving the faith altogether because they say, "Well, I don't. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Therefore, I'm just going to abandon everything." And it's like, no, no, no.
It's
Maybe
put
what we
on the
need to
tools.
do is just think more about it and realize,
Yeah.
it's not as how do I put this? Um, there's a lot to think about. There's a lot to consider, and uh, I don't know. Maybe some people are just too easy to give up on it because it seems like it's a lot of hard work, and it is hard work, but it's good hard. It's good work, uh,
No,
because it like it yeah,
I
like
feel
what
you.
you're saying. It affects everything.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel you on that, Ben. And I actually agree. The one thing I would say is I don't necessarily know if they're, I mean, I think some people probably are intimidated by the hard intellectual work. I
Mhm.
would like to think a little better that people leave the faith for different reasons.
Yeah.
Hopefully. He knocks on wood. But uh, that was my mistake. If you can hear my dogs, that's totally my mistake. My wife will kill me. So, what I was going to say, though, was that I think Christians that grow up with that strong coherent, not even the strong coherent system. I think a lot of times it's just easy to fall into the trap because everything's just given to me, right? Like if I
Mhm.
need to know something, I go to Google. What thinking theologically is important, and what it does is it gives us tools and strength and framework to exercise some control over not only what I think, but how I think it, like how I
Mhm.
construct what I believe. Um,
Yeah.
and so a big goal of mine when we're doing this podcast, and a big goal of mine in my own life is to always try to have and to teach and to give others the ability to do that. I don't always do it flawlessly. It's really hard, and there's a million different ways this applies to everything in life. Applies, not implies, applies. But
Mhm.
for our own particular podcast over theology, we really want to give you these tools because we don't want you to feel not only either overwhelmed where you want to just jump off board because you don't want to go through the intellectual labor of like how do I become a Christian, but also so you're not intimidated by trying to have that conversation, right? Like by trying to have that inner dialogue or even external
Mhm.
dialogue. If you're a person that processes through conversation with other people, maybe you're engaging with
Mhm.
non-Christians on a daily basis, and maybe they're very adamant. Maybe they're always like, "Hey, why do you believe what you believe?" And if you haven't been given the tools or you don't feel always equipped, you know that's what we're trying to do is help you think theologically and give you food for thought and try to guide you with some guide rails about like what is true and
Mhm.
what's not by giving you that context and that history, right? And tell you like
Yeah.
this is what the church has believed and this is why they believed it, like so that way now you can do that stuff, but you're not doing it on your own, right? Like you don't climb Mount Everest with a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. Like that's not like why, like why.
Yeah.
So my point to say is why would we go about trying to live a life and live one like as a thoughtful like real life person, like an authentic person, and like really believing in something that requires a lot of you. Like it's not easy to be a Christian. Let's not play that game. Like
Mhm.
it's not, it's gonna, I mean, you have to take up your cross and follow him. That's part of it. There's a cost to you too. um, you have to be able to lay down pieces of you, maybe all at once, maybe over time, depending on how you go about believing that. But the point is that there's something that it does take from you, and it does have some weight. That's more of a sermon than it is this. But what I'm really trying to get at is that maybe we've gone about talking about this in the wrong way historically. Maybe we've gone about not preparing our churches to do stuff like this historically. Maybe we haven't given you or even you know our future generations the tools to have these conversations and to do this.
Mhm.
um, why would we do all this if we weren't going to exercise some control over how it should be done, like why would we base our entire life around something like that? Why would we make it the center of our own existence if we don't have any kind of rules or regulations, or if it's just what you've been taught? That doesn't feel really meaningful or real. That feels really shallow and spoon fed. And I always liken it to this, like, and this sounds really dumb, but this year I'm trying to make a goal for myself, and this is why I'm doing it. I wanted to read 20 books, and I did that because I listen to a lot of audiobooks because I have a lot of downtime. When I used to drive to work, and I had a very long commute, so it was a great way for me to like unwind after work or not be stressed out going in. It was a good way for me to relax or listen to some podcasts like this one. Doing those kind of things. Shameless plug. So I would do those things. And it was great, but I wanted to read 20 books this year because I found that a lot of information that I ingested that way, I didn't have to work for it. It was just handed to me, right? Like when I Google something, I don't retain it and it doesn't mean anything to me. And I can kind of interact with it, but I feel like I have to really pause the podcast or like pause the book and like think, but like the whole idea is I'm doing it in such a way that it's passive and it's like spoon fed. And I think a lot of times we don't want to think theologically. We don't know how to think theologically or how to think in a lot of different ways. Not that we aren't bad thinkers, but maybe we just don't know how to think consistently or very well, or we don't practice it. That's the word I'm looking for. We don't practice it because it's so much easier to just to ask, rather than to find. Does that make any sense, Ben? Or did I just go off on a really far tangent?
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you're right. Thinking theologically, like actually considering, what we believe about whatever it is and how that affects how we interpret the world around us, how that affects how we like interact with ourselves, and how we interact with, our beliefs. Yeah, sometimes it feels like the only time we need to think theologically is when we're going through like a crisis or something.
Yeah.
Like
What if
like
we
we
could
have someone
exercise some
pass away and
control?
it's like, okay, well what does scripture teach about this? Or you're feeling really depressed. What does scripture teach about this? And then like you just go online, you type it in, and then you get 50 quotes from the Bible about depression, and you're just like, okay, and you just read through it.
And they help for 10
And again,
minutes until you feel depressed again.
say what?
And they help for 10 minutes until you feel depressed again.
Yeah, exactly. Or you just listen to a nice song that makes you feel better for a little while. I'm not saying those are in and of themselves bad things, because sometimes I do that just because I need a starting point, or I just need a quick refresher, or I'm just like you're just in one of those moods. But I think you're right. This is something that uh, not individuals have failed at, but that church leaders, I'm talking to myself, have typically failed at not helping people know how to think theologically, like how to process things. So like when we're preparing for this podcast, like I'll read different sources, I'll look online, check out different things. A lot of times they don't agree with each other. And thinking theologically, at least for me, in those instances, is like how do you figure out, like how do you get to the heart of what's going on here? Like how do you reconcile differences of opinion, especially when it comes to things like scripture, stuff like that? And that's where thinking theologically comes into play. What makes the most sense? Being able to process through it, seeing, uh, well, this person said this statement, but then how does that affect our idea of this? How does that come into play? I know on the face of it that sounds very complex, but it's like, I mean, you could liken it to anything that you do just passively. Like reading a book, you could read a book passively where your eyes are just sort of skimming the words, but you're not retaining anything. So you walk away and you just have no idea what you just read. Or you watch a movie and you're just staring blankly at the screen,
Or you're on your phone.
just watching, yeah, just watching everything happen, but you're not really thinking about it. Um, and you miss the whole experience, and it just becomes just this empty. It just becomes a waste of time,
So why,
essentially.
yeah, so why live life as a passenger? Like that's what I was trying to get at is like
Yeah.
exercise, like what this allows us to do is exercise some control in a healthy way. So like, Ben, you gave some great examples, like, and I want to take one step further. Like, we've talked a lot about death today. Like when we did our podcast, we talked about death, right? People dying and like how that shakes me
Yeah.
to the core. Like, you know, if you've been if you only have one belief system and you don't have a really good framework on how to think, and you didn't feel comfortable in that belief system, or and you thought your way out of it, or you heard conflicting information that was more compelling, and you didn't have, I don't know, you just kind of bought into what someone told you, like, whoever the last person to talk to you was, Christian or atheist, might give you a really different funeral experience. So it's,
Mhm.
which is
Yeah.
playful, stupid, but it's very true, right? And this is a common experience for like Christians in college, right? When they take their first like philosophy class or something, or
Mhm.
take their first history class, and some things are challenged that maybe they didn't grow up challenging, because they don't have a strong framework for their own theology, and they don't understand the how that interplays in their life and what that means, and like are okay and comfortable wrestling with those questions. I think they get overwhelmed and they just have to kind of jump one way or the other. And I and it's just a really sad experience. And I think what happens is it really pushes people to like get critical of like higher academic studies. And I'm not advocating that everybody should be a PhD in it or THD or whatever. No, like don't do that. Like do what you want to do.
Mhm.
But what I'm advocating for is like these people put a lot of thought into stuff. Like read their stuff and be okay with it. Like try to learn it and understand it. But what
Mhm.
I'm also advocating for is the ability to like not just stay at a default state of your own individual kind of standard template, right? Based on how you grew up, where you're from, your ethnicity, your IQ, your insert whatever little caveat you want that constructs this kind of like cutout of a person, right? That has no actual
Mhm.
deep, real, meaningful, intellectual, authentic life. They're just a template, right? And I think a lot of times we reduce people down to that, or reduce ourselves down to that, because we don't take the time to do that kind of stuff. So that's really what I want to challenge with thinking theologically. It's less about being a theologian and more about like, for what we're doing in particular, exercising some control so that those kind of life events don't challenge you. Like, we see this a lot. I see this a lot with like, I mean, right now we're seeing it a lot in our political space, and I don't mean this to get political, but we talk a
Mhm.
lot in America. The problem is identity politics. People so ingrain their beliefs into their life that they can't have them challenged. Otherwise, you're challenging who they are as a person, and then it becomes not. It doesn't become like an actual thought, like growth possibility. It becomes a threat to your identity because it's not
Mhm.
thought through. You're not thinking theologically. It's not part of who you are to be able to process and handle that. It's just a belief that
Mhm.
you hold so tightly that you've based your life around it and you don't have a real reason for it. So if you question my belief and I have to let go of it, or I might be wrong, you pull that string out and the whole system falls apart. Your life shatters. And it shouldn't be like
Yeah.
that. It just shouldn't be like that. It's not a good way to live. I don't feel like that's a good way
Mhm.
to live. And I wouldn't want to live that way.
Right.
And I hope if you don't, I mean, I hope you don't. I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm just really passionate about this. This is something I'm very passionate about. It just makes me really sad because like I have some very close people in my life that I feel sometimes live like that, and the work they
Mhm.
have to do to stay consistent
Mhm.
is so hard, and it just takes a toll on them emotionally, like in a way that it shouldn't. And I'm like, in some
Yeah.
ways, like it should be difficult to be a Christian. Christianity has a cost, but that's not the kind
Mhm.
of difficulty that it should be. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
you know what I
Yeah,
mean? Like
because you're right. Like we do need to live. I mean, we're made for it. We're made for logic and consistency.
God gave
And
you
you're
a
right.
brain.
Like when you go through
Use it.
life, just like riding the waves of just whatever's happening around you, it is so exhausting because you have to deal with so many paradoxes and so
You're
many
just reacting.
inconsistencies, and you try to resolve them, and sometimes you can't, and it's so stressful.
Yeah. So yeah, I just that when you asked me, if we could do something on thinking theologically, that was the stuff I've been really thinking about the last couple of weeks, because it's been
Mhm.
very real in my life. Like how these people that I'm very close with, and I was wondering, like, some of my good friends. I'm like, man, they have to jump through they have to do these intellectual, mental gymnastics, and it's for their
Mhm.
own emotional sanity. And I'm like, I don't understand how you have to bend over backward like that. I just and why
Mhm.
you would, and just the amount of strain it puts on their life just so that they can not give up on something else that they hold dear, instead of just saying maybe that was a little wrong in the first place, and just starting there and trying to work on that. And they just it becomes more and more grained as I'm getting older. I'm not old, but I'm getting older, and as they're getting older, it's getting harder, and you just get
Yeah.
more attached to it. It's It's very akin to some of the literature I've been reading. Looking at you, Lord of the Rings and the Ring, Gollum.